it. Trust me. Okay, so I also want to say hello to all those who've joined us on our YouTube channel. Don't fail to subscribe, etc. Like us, share
Like,
our link with
subscribe,
your
and tell your
friends.
friends.
Yeah, press the ding bing button, etc. Is everybody there from the studio? Are we waiting or what's the score? Okay. There's only Alan who's joined via Zoom. I can't see you, Alan, but I'm assuming you are there. Okay, fantastic. Hi, everyone. Can you hear us? Yeah, there we go. Hello. So thanks for joining. I'm so excited to welcome Stuart Candy. He's a good friend, but he's also a really well-known futurist and experiential futurist. And you're all in for a treat. So I do want to do a formal introduction. Stuart Candy, Dr. Stuart Candy is director of Situation Lab that you should all just Google and follow straight away, and associate professor of social foresight at Parsons School of Design in New York, and advisor to NASA JPL in Los Angeles. His work in design and future, spanning practice, education, scholarship, and public engagement, is recognized for changing the landscape of both fields. His publications include the world's first doctoral project on their connections, the futures of everyday life, the edited collection, Design and Futures, long-running blog, The Skeptical Futurist, acclaimed card game, The Thing from the Future, and public access toolkit, The Futures Bazaar. I will post all these links in the chat in a moment, but for those of you who are in the studio, I'll ask Elizabeth to share. The public access toolkit won the Association of Professional Futurists inaugural award for inclusive foresight. Dr. Candy has previously held appointments at the University of Southern California, Carnegie Mellon University, School of the Art Institute of Chicago, OCAD University, and California College of Arts. He has worked with leading educational, scientific, business, and cultural institutions worldwide, including the International Red Cross, IFRC, World Economic Forum, Smithsonian Institution, IDEO, BBC, and the New York Times. In 2022, he received the Core 77 Speculative Design Award for the UNDP Commission Experiential Futures Project, Imaginations is a Commons. Stuart is really generous with us because he's just landed back in New York from a conference in Austria, and there was he's just moved home from Pittsburgh to New York as well. So he's just landed and he's probably jet lagged, but we're so excited, Stuart, that you're with us, and I'm going to hand over to you. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Anab and Elizabeth, for your vital help behind the scenes. And hello to you all. You're very, very, very tiny on my screen, but hopefully when we transition into a more conversational mode, which I hope we can do in the last part of today's session, I'll be able to see you a little bit better and also hear you, and as we have a bit of an exchange. But so what I was asked to do was provide a little bit of an intro to futures and how it relates to design. And well, I mean, I've added design, media, and the arts because really it's all fair game from my point of view, as you'll see. So this presentation is about futures slash foresight in the field. Those terms are kind of used interchangeably at the moment. Why it exists, why that field exists, and some of what it offers to help people and communities think more systematically and creatively about what could happen in whatever context they or you are in. And in order to help us, to help them, to help whoever it is that's trying to make their way through life and through the historical process to navigate that change a bit more wisely. So this is obviously not going to be exhaustive. This is an entire field. It's not just like a tool or a method or kind of an angle. But I do hope it's a useful orientation on top of what I'm sure is already some ambient, if not more detailed, awareness of it that you've already come across. And I also hope that it works, that it ends up kind of functioning for you as an invitation to explore a bit further, to do some more reading, to do some thinking, to maybe fold some of these ways of operating into your practice if they aren't there already. So here's the plan. I'll do a quick intro to actually, it'll be even quicker because I think that bio that Anab just recounted probably does a bunch of the work of the introduction of situating where I'm coming from. But then there are two acts or two parts. The first one will be sort of introducing foresight through three dimensions or three ways in which I think it stretches or challenges our thought. And then the second act is in the kind of application of futures or foresight in design, media, and the arts, which relates, I would say, more to one of those three dimensions than the other two. And then we can have a conversation, which I'm really looking forward to. So I'm a professional futurist and a design professor. And, what I do or try to do is engage this field, this futures/foresight field, as a core competency for designers, leaders, and ultimately as a part of how everybody is able to think and act. I believe it would be really useful for our entire society to have an elevated capacity for thinking about alternative futures. And the way in which I should really say we, because this is a profoundly collaborative and collective practice. The way that we do this, or ways that we do this, have been using arts and design and media-based approaches to making futures, that is, things that haven't happened yet and may not happen, but hypothetical circumstances, more thinkable and feelable in the present. So, as you heard, I'm currently at or as of quite recently, at Parsons School of Design here in New York City. Before that, a series of other places that all have quite cool buildings, as you can see. And actually, although it wasn't officially part of my, it wasn't an appointment, but I spent a very influential week at the Royal College of Art with Tony Dunn and Fiona Raby, influential on me, in 2009. And I dare say it was maybe mutually influential, actually, because what I was doing there, what the invitation that they had given me in 2008 was to kind of to do a little bit like what we're doing now, introduce futures to a bunch of practitioners and learners who were geared towards this direction, but who hadn't necessarily come across the field of futures or foresight per se. And some of the stuff that I showed them, of our own work and then of the practices and heuristics and frameworks in the futures field kind of immediately exploded from there. It was a very kind of exciting moment. But this stuff doesn't just exist in academia. These are some of the organizations I've worked with in capacities, smaller or larger, over just the last handful of years, really. And, I'm only speaking from my own point of view, not trying to encompass everybody's with that. But yeah, and I've mentioned some of the current work that we're doing with the New York Times, with NASA, JPL, the BBC project we might get to a little later, because that's a framework that could be of use and relevance to some of you. And then I'll add one more, which is this project that I've been doing with a very close friend and longtime colleague, Jake Dunnigan of Institute for the Future. We went to grad school together many years ago. And we have, since 2005, been introducing futures practices to mayors, to city leaders from across the United States, to help them think more systematically and creatively and in more of a visionary way about the cities that they are responsible to as elected representatives. And so before I became a full-time professor, I was an in-house futurist for a global engineering firm called Arup, which is best known for this kind of project. This is the Channel Tunnel and all those buildings in London with nicknames, the Gherkin and the Shard and the Walkie-Talkie. Those are Arup engineered projects, the Centre Pompidou, et cetera, et cetera. And I mention this because I think I had just finished the doctoral project that Anab mentioned, The Futures of Everyday Life, which was about the intersections between, or some of them, between futures and design. And one of the things that really brought home to me, not just the doctoral project, but working as a futurist in a design and engineering context, is when you're designing anything, you're creating a fragment of the future. When you're designing anything, you are creating a fragment of the future. And that's especially obvious, perhaps, when it comes to large buildings and infrastructure, because if you can make a hospital or a university campus or a business, an office building or an opera house or whatever it is, bring that into the world and make it stand up, for generations upon generations, then you're literally shaping part of a future landscape. You're living with the consequences of the thinking, and also I would say the non-thinking, the things that you don't think about in the course of the building, of the designing and building and engineering process. You're shaping the futures, whether or not you're really, regardless of how thoughtful or how foresightful you're being about it. But I think it's also true, this intrinsic connection between futures and design I think it's also true of designed artifacts at other scales, right? And this includes systems, which are less sort of artifact-like in the way that they behave and work, but the way that systems are set up and operate, like the organizations that we work within, political processes, those are, in a manner of speaking, designed as well, and some of them are more futures fit than others. So futures and design are intrinsically linked. I don't suspect that'll be kind of a mind-blowing revelation to any of you, given that you study with Anab Jain. But everyone everyone designs, that Herb Simon, the Nobel laureate, some decades ago, who devises courses of action aimed at changing existing situations into preferred ones, which is another way of saying everyone designs, and design being a synonym for intent. But I think we can also say that everyone futures too. Everyone thinks about the future. That doesn't mean everybody is equally skilled at designing or at thinking about futures. And what we're trying to do here is sort of elevate our capacity to do those things more mindfully, more effectively. And there's a bigger picture here, beyond just the academic flyby that we've done, and the snapshot of some of these applications in organizational contexts. There is this back-to-back pair of journals from 2019, or issues rather, of the Journal of Futures Studies, which my colleague Stuart Potter, then at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, and I put together and then reissued it in this book form. And I'm mentioning this because actually this book is totally free. So to the extent that this is interesting to any of you, and I hope it is, you should go just download it and take a look, and you will see that there's a kind of mosaic or a real array of perspectives here, including from Anab herself. Thank you again, Anab, for taking part in that. So this is a place where you can, I guess, get a broader sense, but it's from just before the pandemic. So what is that, like 3.5 years ago now? And it's a snapshot of ways in which these worlds have been coming together over the last couple of decades, especially. I won't read this entire quote, but this is something that Cher and I wrote for the introduction to the first of those two back-to-back issues. And what we said at the end of that is part of what bringing design and futures into sustained dialogue does, is to allow each field to become more fluent in a second language, which is the other's native tongue. So there is a way in which design practices are sort of extremely good at certain things and less good at others, but that are implicit in what they do. And conversely, futures is the other way around. It's really good at I can be a little bit more concrete about this. Design is sort of traditionally about giving form and shaping things, making them. So it's kind of a grounded up thing. It has all these implications for what kinds of world, as we were just saying, what kinds of world are possible or would exist within the world that you design those things, that you're designing them for. And then futures is really good at the top-down part. And by top-down, I don't mean hierarchically. I mean in terms of abstract to concrete. It's really good at carving up imaginary space into pieces so that we can actually talk about these things. But what bringing futures and design together does is kind of help them complement each other, make it a more complete and impactful kind of practice. So when we're talking about futures, we're talking about generally longer time horizons than we might think about on a day-to-day basis, larger uncertainties, less fixity, more openness. Kind of, dealing with futures can be a little bit disorienting, and maintaining your orientation when thinking through them is part of the work here. Futures or foresight is a transdisciplinary field, I would say. I don't really call it a discipline. I think it is a transdisciplinary field. People who operate in it come from all kinds of disciplines and apply it to all kinds of disciplines. And of course, it includes the futures of everything. So, if that's not transdisciplinary, I don't know what is. But it's emerged over the last several generations to meet the need for more systematic consideration of how change could unfold and how we can work with it. And it goes back further in time than one might think. And I want to say, the capacity to think about things that are otherwise is inherent to the human mind and a preoccupation of our cultures, since time immemorial. But in terms of like a field, a conscious effort to get better at thinking about futures, about later time, the earliest specific call that I know of comes from this person. And instead of
No, we
I won't play the audio clip. We have time. We'll save that time for our own conversation. But that was H.G. Wells, Herbert George Wells, who's best known or best remembered these days for being one of the kind of progenitors of speculative fiction, of science fiction. And on BBC Radio in 1932, he said, among other things, all these new things, these new inventions and new powers come crowding along. Everyone is fraught with consequences, yet it's only after something has hit us hard that we set about dealing with it. And in the same talk, 91 years ago now, he says there are hundreds of thousands of students of history in the world, and thousands upon thousands of professors who spend their time upon the records of the past. But there's not a single person anywhere who makes a full-time special job of thinking about the future. Why aren't there professors of foresight? Why isn't there a field of foresight? Okay, that last bit I'm paraphrasing. But so these are the things, if you've encountered Wells at all, then it might be through the films that we're constantly making from the stories written in the late 19th and early 20th century. But even the idea of the time machine was a Wells invention. The notion of a specific way of changing one's time context from an 1895 short story. So experiences are accumulating in organizations, I would say. And I'm putting this to you as a provocation. You can agree or disagree or maybe partly agree, but I think that argument that we were looking at from 1932 a moment ago about we tend to operate in a reactive way is sadly still true. So experiences are accumulating in organizations and in the public sphere of the radical inadequacy of our efforts to think ahead. So that's one kind of point in what could be a very rich kind of pointillist painting of futures, precedents, and histories. Another point comes from Elise Boulding, who is a founding figure in the futures field and also in peace studies and a feminist historian. And Elise Boulding, gives us the provocation, this idea that we need to be thinking about about whatever is going on in the news, whatever we encounter happening, in the world around us today, in a context, in a historical context that stretches backward as well as forward, because you can't grasp events, you can't grok what they signify. Solely on their own terms. They need to be understood, in a context. And then another kind of point, I suppose, another point in this painting or this constellation that we're building here, a provocation from Jim Data, who is, I guess, a founder of the academic field of futures studies. He's the person I studied with. I did my master's and PhD in futures with Data in Hawaii. And Data said years ago, the future cannot be studied because the future does not exist. Which is an interesting sentence at first glance from somebody often described as a founder of future studies. What's going on here? The future cannot be studied because the future does not exist. And this is called, sort of somewhat tongue-in-cheek, maybe, a law, his first law of the futures. But notice the S in futures there and the singular in the quote itself. It's the future cannot be studied. We can't study the future because there is no single future to study. And so the aim, this is important, I think, foundational notion from the field, which again, please feel free I want you to think this stuff through and weigh it up for yourself and see what you make of it. But the aim is not to predict the future, but to develop and use alternative futures, plural, for solving problems and seizing opportunities ahead. And it revolves around not looking at the future directly because you can't, and there isn't one. What it deals with, the material, if you like, that it's working with as a field, it's called images of the future. So ideas about the future, which can be, literally images. They could be paintings or drawings or cinematic representations or Netflix streaming shows or novels or plays or manga or graphic, graphic novels, whatever you like, really. But also, not just the sort of quote unquote fictional representations of futures, but the forecasts that companies or governments make about GDP and the prophecies that may be issued by people willing to work in a prophetic mode. All of these things can be seen as or are encompassed under the umbrella of images of the future. And if you can name a trend, something that is changing in the present, there's actual evidence of something going on, that might produce a kind of corresponding image of the future. What if this were to continue? Or events that you could imagine happening in the future. I call this the content axis. This is Data's kind of diagram, but I've added the content axis, and then there's the process axis, which is that each of these images corresponds to or can be unpacked in terms of the theory of the case that it embeds. So any given image of the future could be sort of examined or investigated or challenged in terms of what the theory of change or the theory of the future is that it kind of implies. And then there are the methods by which it is either generated or, maybe it's not generated using a sort of an expert method of any kind, but there are methods that you can use to bring to bear on being more thoughtful and intentional about sifting through those images and their implications. So this is kind of a way of saying what futures studies as a field is interested in. There's the content axis, all the different ideas about the future that people have. And then these processes for unpacking them and for diversifying them, challenging them or weighing them up or discussing them, and maybe adding to them, asking what's missing, what other kinds of images ought we to have in our repertoire. And all of that, I would say, is part of the practice and the scholarship of futures work. And this idea of images of the future comes from a mid 20th century sociologist, a Dutch sociologist, Fred Polak, who was Jewish and survived the Second World War by hiding out in the German occupied Netherlands. And after that experience, there are many ways of coming through a harrowing trauma like that. But the way that this particular person, Fred Polak, experienced it was as almost a kind of, I guess, a signal or an instance of the way in which humanity creates history, as a sort of as a species that shapes its own destiny, and that got him interested in how various cultures over time had imagined futures for themselves and what happened to them. And the pattern that he thought he saw was that when the image of the future that a culture, sort of that predominated within a culture was in full bloom, then that was kind of a leading indicator that it would continue to kind of go from strength to strength. And when that image of the future began to fade or fail, decay and lose its vitality, as he put it, the culture does not long survive. So again, I put this to you as a kind of, as a thought for you to think with. What are the images of the future that you encounter? What are the patterns in them? Are they particularly, do they lean in one way or another? And if so, what do those leanings perhaps suggest about the kinds of impact on the future that the presence of those images have? And so, there's a really wide array of of contributors to a really rich conversation about the future or alternative futures. Not everybody who is relevant to it is, sort of necessarily a card-carrying futurist, and that does not matter. What is important is the variety and the depth and the kind of, I guess, intent to um, to use futures in ways that bring about preferred change and avoid catastrophe or non-preferred change. So, the great Octavia Butler says in the parable of the talents, one of the characters says, we can do something no other animal species has ever had the option to do. We can choose. We can go on building and destroying until either we destroy ourselves or destroy the ability of our world to sustain us, or we can make. I think, and these are words to live by if you sit at the intersection in any way of design and futures. So, and I'll in terms of this, kind of again constellation of perspectives, and I freely admit that it is a partial and incomplete one, but hopefully there are some trailheads here of interest to you. Futures, I think, as a field, it can seem esoteric or sort of like it thinks it's special or trying to create, kind of have a conversation about futures that other people can't access. And that's actually completely, I think, the opposite of how it ought to work and how, certainly the intent of everyone I work with and think are interesting in the field, that it's actually what the field is doing is building on something that everybody has, which is a capacity to think about the future. That is a side effect of the kind of brains that we have as human beings. And so the tools and the practices and the methods and the jargon, all of that stuff, the whole sort of field as a field is kind of about amplifying or augmenting a capacity that everyone has, and that perhaps would be useful for everyone to be able to augment as well. And so, it's especially important in certain areas. I think one of the reasons why I gravitated to design is that designers make decisions on behalf of everyone else about how the world is going to be shaped. And in that sense, kind of the designers are leaders of a world shaping set of practices that as humans we all engage in to some degree. But it needs to be distributed throughout a culture or an organization in order to be fully effective. That is this futures capability does, I think. And so my favorite characterization of the field, I'm deliberately not saying definition because I don't think definitions are nearly as useful as we might sometimes assume. But this is Ashish Nandi, an Indian political psychologist and public intellectual, who says, and I won't read this whole quote, but I love this idea of futures as a game of dissenting visions, a game of dissenting visions. And so in playing the game, what we're trying to do is to play within the space of images of the future and ask, what else might be true? What else could become the case? What else can we imagine? What else can we pursue? So there's a deeply kind of political, with a small p, dimension to this, because of course what gets imagined and what doesn't, what stories are held up and repeated over and over, and which ones are marginalized or never even articulated. It's harder to imagine a more political question than that. And so there is a sense in which what we're doing here is leaning into a challenge of not just imagining for fun or imagining for success as designers, but imagining as human beings engaged in an adventure and co-creating something, co-creating a historical process towards perhaps a world the imagining of which galvanizes us and is worth pursuing. So there are a lot of ways to play. There are a lot of ways to play this game of dissenting visions. And I would say that that one of the main subsets of those ways to play that we'll be talking about today come from this need to scaffold imagination, to think, not just sort of think from the neck up, but to feel bodily things that we haven't experienced before. Okay, so that's the quick intro, and now I want to contextualize this with what I call three dimensions of foresight, which are three different, yeah, almost poses or like yogic stretches in our capacity to think and feel into futures, in our capacity to foresee. And so as not to, keep you on tenterhooks, I'll just say what they are up front. Difference, diversity, and depth. Difference, diversity, and depth. So difference is the question of how's the world changing and where might that lead? How's the world changing? Where might that lead? The second, diversity, is what are the different ways that an unpredictable system could evolve? And the third is depth. What would it mean and how might it feel to be in particular future circumstances? And I hope to show that these aren't just sort of a random set of questions, or that they sort of like systematically account for some of the moves that we're trying to make whenever we're attempting to do futures work, and particularly how designers might, and media makers and artists, but how designers might play into the process. So difference, this first dimension. I won't take a ton of time on each of these, by the way, but I just want to try to sketch this out. So the first dimension is addressing that the future context is not the same as the present context. Not the same as the present context. I think many of us tend to think, not always intentionally, in quite a linear way about time. Uh, I suppose a reason for this might be that our brains evolved in a context where things didn't change very much from generation to generation. I mean, certainly, yes, they changed cyclically, but if you compare, the kind of world and the kinds of changing context that we inhabit now in this, what is it, about a generation into the 21st century, if you want to count time that way. Um, if you go back, 1,000 years, you wouldn't be talking about, the a person in midlife basically inhabiting a different kind of world from that same person when they were born. But that is kind of a reality that we're in now, and so there's this sort of tendency, I think, to extrapolate in a rather linear way that doesn't help with the task, particularly that we're engaged in here. This is a quote from Judi Dench in the Best Exotic Marigold Hotel. I don't know if anybody saw that movie, but her character says at one point, "All we know about the future is that it will be different." And I think that's quite a good point. That is all we know about the future. Very often we think in terms of whatever's going on in the present, just extended indefinitely. So we kind of we're not even taking account of this one thing that we know, that the future is going to be different. So this image is kind of a reminder to me to tell you a funny story from when Jim Data went to Hawaii in the late 60s and started teaching futures to students there. In 1970, there was a bus strike. So, bus drivers were striking, and for the usual reasons. And that year, he started in his introductory futures classes having people write an essay about the world 30 years out. So this was a regular assignment that actually I did when I moved there in 2005 as well. But like generations of students did this, and I think the first one was in 1970. And so these students in 1970, thinking 30 years out, so looking out to the year 2000, their essays about the world in the year 2000 were filled with bus strikes. That's what was going on in the year 2000 for these students in 1970. And it's almost kind of quaint or funny or like, what a bunch of dills. How could they imagine that the world 30 years out is just going to be filled with whatever is in front of their faces? But I guarantee, my friends, that if we did this essay today, I mean, you can dispute this, but I guarantee it'll just be wall to wall with Chat GPT and the things that are in the headlines now. That this is the way we tend to colonize our imaginaries of the future with what's going on in the present. And it's it's not useless. It's just that one needs to realize that is kind of level one of the game, dissenting visions. So there are practices that one can consciously engage in, research practices to kind of look for the signals of things that might be on their way to, on their way to becoming more influential as part of the future landscape, to grappling, in other words, with this first dimension of difference, identifying changes earlier on in the process, like before they are in front of everyone's face, an obvious trend, like on the cover of Time magazine or whatever your preferred newspaper might be. Like once things are there, then they're not really early in their development anymore. Once they're in everybody's awareness. So as futures practice kind of asks us to constantly be looking for the less obvious signals. And a way of doing that, a common way of doing that, is by sort of turning over the stones of change under different sort of disciplinary lenses, so to mix metaphors a bit. But anyway, you get the idea. If you want to understand how the future could be different from the present, you are looking for change not just through one lens, maybe the one that you were trained in. If you're an economist, you're thinking about things in terms of economics. If you're, political science scientist, you're thinking about it in terms of the political change. Or if you're a technologist or a computer person, then you're looking at it through a technological lens. No, the idea is that change that affects the entire system can come from anywhere and does. And so you cultivate a kind of curiosity about what those emerging changes may be through all of these different lenses. And so back when I started at Arup, there was a few years earlier already this kind of card deck that had been distributed to every engineer in the firm as a way of, well, partly as a way of putting the then newly formed foresight team on the radar of people internally, so they knew, oh, this is a service we could use, or these are colleagues we could work with. But anyway, these drivers of change cards and this program continues to exist within Arup. Basically profiles kind of one card at a time, some trend or emerging issue, using this framework of STEEP as a way of kind of bringing some sense making to it. And it's, another example would be one of the first futures projects I did was for the British government in 2004. As it was attempting to stand up a formal foresight capacity inside the government. And so I was working for an external consultancy, but we were hired to do a kind of scan of scans. So basically looking at secondary research. But it was, again, using this framework of STEEP called horizon scanning or environmental scanning. Those terms are usually used interchangeably. And in order to create a report for these policymakers, these government people, to be able to sort of think more systematically about what kinds of policy changes they may need to make in anticipation of changes in the wider world. So that's sort of a second example, right, of applying a tool set for the purposes of getting more systematic at dealing with difference. So the future context is not the same as the present context. Doesn't mean every single thing is equally different, or that, and in fact, that everything will change equally over any given span of time. But it does mean that sort of a future is a future to the extent that there is a delta or a sort of a before and after, a contrast between the present in which you're doing the work and the later time that you're trying to wrap your head around. And if you're only responding to conditions, if you're waiting until they're on the cover of Time and going, oh, gee, we might need to do something about this, then then you're falling into that trap that H.G. Wells identified in 1932. It's only after something has hit us hard that we set about dealing with it, and that that means constantly playing catch up, always being on the back foot. That's not futures work. So, there's also this technique called backcasting, which is a sort of, deliberate coinage from the geographer John Robinson, to contrast with forecasting, where you sort of sit in the present and try to think what the future might be. Backcasting is to put yourself virtually in a hypothesized future state and ask, how could it have gotten this way? And there's a quite popular tool called Three Horizons, which I would say is sort of a way of doing backcasting by talking about about three different sort of horizons of change, where the first horizon is the present, The third is however far out you're looking, and the second is a kind of interim transition between the two. Everything that exists at one time did not. Everything that currently exists one day will no longer. There's this idea of layers of change moving at different rates. This is a way of, I guess, getting a bit deeper into the idea I shared a moment ago of saying that the future will be different doesn't mean that everything is equally different, or that or that the things that are different are sort of um, somehow interchangeable with each other in their significance. Not at all. It's more that that everything is changing just at different rates, and the changes don't spring fully formed out of nowhere. They're often foreseeable once one learns to look, and that's what those scanning processes are for. Whether it's the diffusion of a technology through society, or the growth of brewer's yeast in a vat of beer, or the citations of a particular reference. There's this kind of S-curve shape, and if you can catch, if you're looking for things prior to their tipping point, prior to them becoming, fully blown trends, then you are maybe in the practice, or we can develop a practice of asking, what if this became this thing, that's just here in embryo, perhaps, or in an early stage, what would it look like? What would it mean for it to be more developed later on? So that's the first dimension, difference. The future is another place. And the takeaway is it's important to ask how the future context might be different from the present, and to make a habit of tracking change in different aspects of the system. But once you begin to track those changes, you notice that they don't all just point in the same direction. It's not like everything you're seeing, every signal in the present is sort of pointing unambiguously to the same single future, because they're not. And so diversity is the second dimension, asking about the variety of alternative futures that the present could kind of give birth to, if you will. And so there's this idea, this linear notion. I think usually people, they might actually disavow this if you put this in front of them explicitly, but I would say implicitly, this is very often how the thinking looks, that sort of the present is solid and we can kind of, go outside and measure it and take pictures of it and document it. And the past, well, it's a bit more of a dotted line. It depends, right? And the further back in time, the more dotted it gets, because some of the evidence will have disappeared and or have been overwritten or lost. Similarly, conversely, in this linear model, the future is sort of like a mirror image of the past. It's dotted. You can kind of make it out, but the further out into the future you try to look, well, the harder it gets, because you just don't have that kind of evidence base for what the world might be 100 years from now, as you might for a year from now. But so this is a kind of, I think, an illusion, actually, never mind that. Let's just call it. It's an inadequate and not very skillful way of thinking about time. Having a single image of the future, and no matter how compelling that image might be, how sort of convinced you are of the rightness of a particular thesis or hypothesis, it's incomplete. So, because whatever those expectations are, very often there's a surprise that deviates from the kind of the straight line that we'd anticipated, and then it's a matter of sort of stitching it back together and going, see, okay, I get how this happened now, and then digesting that into the historical record. But the fact that constantly happens is should sort of be a lesson to us, or a prompt to us to realize that maybe having a monolinear or a mono-futurist mentality is itself the problem. I don't know if you can think of any recent surprises that have occurred, technologically or politically or epidemiologically in terms of disease. Any recent surprises, in our lifetimes, just the last, 6 months, 3 years, 10 years? I'm sure you can. As one of my favorite writers says, history is merely a list of surprises that can only prepare us to be surprised yet again. But so what does it mean to be surprised, to be prepared to be surprised? Well, so this to me is where the S in futures comes in. So this second dimension of diversity is kind of about dealing with the open-endedness or the plurality of alternative futures. And there are a bunch of tools for doing this. This is a version of a diagram that I showed to Tony Dunn and Fiona Raby and their students many years ago now, and that's kind of took off and had a bit of a life of its own after that. This is their version, but there are other all actually of the ways of devising scenarios. I think are kind of ways of trying to grapple with that diversity. So this is from a scenario set created when South Africa was transitioning from apartheid to democracy in the early to mid 1990s. Well, this, and you won't be able to read this text necessarily, but this was a blogger, John Worth, did this map of Brexit during the 3 years or so between the Brexit vote and what actually happened. And so this kind of tree of possibilities it was constantly updating. But notice what it is basically a cone just oriented in this direction and with the particular breakpoints within that cone being named. And then there are other tools like causal layered analysis for analyzing the present and also generating alternative futures. And one of the most widely known and used approaches to dealing with the plurality of futures is a 2x2 scenario matrix, which, I mean, this is not the only use of a 2x2, of course, right? You can use 2x2s for all sorts of things that aren't necessarily about the future, but this as specifically for future kind of wrestling purposes, it's very, very common over the last 30 years or so. This is a scenario set that we used to use at Arup using that exact approach. This is another one that was produced by Salesforce and Deloitte right after the pandemic kicked in 2020. And I used this with leaders from my previous university when I was there, Carnegie Mellon, to think with these alternatives, because we didn't have time to generate our own scenario set. So we were thinking with these hypotheses about what they could mean for the organization going forward. Well, this process, which is not a 2x2, but it's a way of talking about scenarios based on what kinds of stories they contain. So this is called generic images of the future. This comes from Jim Data. And so GROW is a kind of future. It's not a single scenario. It's an umbrella for any scenario that corresponds to the idea of continued growth of population, production, consumption, etc. Collapse is a second umbrella, which could be catastrophic and sudden, or more gradual and inexorable. But that's a second category of scenario or of image of the future. Discipline, a future in which order is deliberately coordinated among the actors or the participants in that future, or imposed from above. So it could be totalitarian, a la the Hunger Games or Gattaca, as pictured here, or it could be embraced peer to peer, as in a kibbutz, or So my point in saying this is that each of these umbrellas contains a lot of futures that may be good, bad, and a mix. They're not. This is not sort of a simple. This is a good future. This is a bad future. These are qualitatively diverse collections of futures. And then the fourth is transform, a future in which a profound historical evolution has occurred, and that might be in terms of consciousness. Or it might be in terms of technology, or those are the two usual variants: a kind of change of a change of consciousness, or a change of technology, like where human brains become uploadable to a silicon substrate, or where AI wakes up, that kind of thing. Those are maybe transform futures. Sometimes they lead to collapse. So this is another way of making sense of that diversity. Right? So diversity, the future is always multiple potentials, not just one. And the takeaway here is it's important for resilient organizations and designers, I would say, to map a range of futures on an ongoing basis to keep up with change. And there's a bunch of ways of doing that. I've just touched on a few. Now, in practice tense, these frameworks can be really powerful ways to generate useful insights. You'll notice I've been showing kind of quite a lot of diagrams, and there's this sort of schematic way of thinking, which I guess I hope it makes sense why that is the case, because we're talking about about ways of carving up imaginary space. Of course, that's abstract, right? I mean, that's the nature of the task, to talk about kinds of futures, which are imaginary constructs. But the issue with that, with that abstraction, with this kind of schematic diagrams and frameworks thing, is that simply raising these possibilities and even, writing good scenarios, like well-researched, engagingly written scenarios, kind of just raising these possibilities, we really need to think about this. It doesn't necessarily change how people really feel or how they decide. And so this brings us to the third dimension of foresight. Remember, the first is difference, just the kind of the basic idea of a future being different from the present. That's kind of like almost the entry level to having a conversation about futures. The second is diversity. We don't know exactly how the future is going to be different. It could be different in a bunch of different ways. So difference, diversity, but then depth is about what would it be like to actually visit one of these futures? How do we make it meaningful to our bodies, and really get under the skin of these possibilities? So depth is the third dimension. And so considering changes in the abstract at a high level, this kind of a world, or read these 3 pages of a scenario. Considering changes at that kind of abstract level is one thing, but how do we get under the skin of them? Because we use our experiences from the past to navigate change. This is something we've learned from neuroscientists over the last 10 or 15 years, that when we challenge ourselves to imagine things occurring in the future, what we're doing is using the same parts of the brain as when we are recalling things that we've actually experienced. And I think a way of sort of characterizing that is that we are, of course, relying on our memories and experiences when we try to concoct futures. So there's a sort of circular problem there, because if you don't have memories of a future that you're trying to prepare for, then you can't remember them. So we have no experiences of the future. And this is an unavoidable epistemological barrier because of how we experience time. You can't sort of go into a future time literally, in order to have those experiences and then prepare for what they might entail. But what we do have is a capacity to imagine, which is probably most fully engaged on a popular basis in games. And I'm kind of always been a movie geek, so cinematic imaginaries of futures actually do, in a weird way, produce memories of things that have not happened. And the existence of these reference points in the culture has an outsized role in the conversations about actual futures. When we try to talk about about future states for the historical process, we're often talking about them in terms of, oh, we're heading towards the Handmaid's Tale, or a Mad Max future, or what about a Star Trek future? I mean, these things were created for other purposes, for entertainment largely, and for literary purposes, but we find ourselves resorting to them for having kind of serious non-fictional conversations about futures, for the want of of vividly depicted futures based on the conversations we actually we might actually want to be having for those for, let's say, UN summit purposes, or the decisions of organizations with affecting millions or billions of people. It seems odd that we have this kind of cultural bifurcation between science fiction for entertainment that we recruit into our real conversations, into our serious planning conversations, and then the serious planning conversations, which themselves tend to be dry and boring and bloodless and abstract. So when it comes to the most significant governance issues that we confront as a species, wherever you want to look on the planet, we're usually barely even trying to grapple with what the futures at issue could be like. And this is true even of, probably the biggest, or it has for a long time been true of even the sort of challenge of our historical era, which is climate crisis and disruption. So this is from the 1.5 degree report. I don't think I added in a comparable slide from the most recent, the 6th assessment report that just came out in recent months. But what this is kind of a scientific effort to describe in really cautious, assiduous, careful terms what kinds of world we're choosing between in terms of our personal behavior and in terms of national and collective policies. But this is how fascinatingly it's put. A resource and energy intensive scenario in which economic growth and globalization lead to widespread adoption of greenhouse gas intensive lifestyles, including high demand for transportation fuels. Yeah, all right, yes, I see. It's this extremely high abstraction, systematic kind of broad brushstroke thing. And of course it is, because that's what responsible science looks like. It's not science's job to tell us what life in that world would be, but somebody needs to do that. Somebody needs to do that in order for us to have those conversations. Are there any photographs of the climate disrupted future in the AR6 report? Well, the answer is no, because that's not its task, and those aren't available. But what's at stake, if you contrast, these tactics with what's at stake in the world, and these images come from New Orleans just after Hurricane Katrina, which happened about 3 weeks after I arrived in Hawaii for grad school. So I just moved to the United States, if you consider Hawaii to be part of the United States, and the experiences of these people on the ground multiplied out over billions of instances. This is what's at stake in how well we are able to think about climate disruption. And so there's an experiential gulf between how we typically represent or narrate futures for those serious purposes and others, and what real situations feel like on the ground. And so the ideal might be to experience actual futures before they happen, right? To sort of be able to time travel. Wouldn't that be nice? It'd be a lot more convenient. But so far, that isn't possible. So how would we get a sense of what possible futures might be like in the ways that the neuroscientists are telling us we can and sort of do? By encoding imagined scenarios into our long-term memory, we can use our prior simulations at later time points so they can substitute for real experiences. We invest in the capacity to imagine futures that may be on the table and worth thinking about. We can use those to have more meaningful conversations in the present. So that's the third dimension, depth. Any future that we get will be as real and as complex as the present is. We must try to not just think, but also feel our way into these future conditions if we're going to grapple with them effectively. So our images of the future should aim to be different from the world we know or are accustomed to thinking about, diverse, that is, different from each other, representative of a wide range of perspectives and reflective of the actual breadth of possibilities, and deep, meaning that they probe beyond the obvious. They have complexity and nuance. They have the qualities, in other words, of lived experience, so that they can affect us emotionally and engage us more than just cognitively from the neck up. And so all three of these dimensions are challenging, but to me, the depth part always seemed to need kind of greater attention. And I guess I should say, this way of parsing what futures does is this is not canonical. So it's not like futurists were going, yeah, there's difference, diversity, and depth, but we just really suck at depth. No, I've kind of retrofitted this onto what I think is at stake when we're trying to think about times to come. That difference is implicit whenever we talk about the future. Diversity is is the strongest kind of philosophical contribution of futures as a field, that pluralizing move, but it leaves untouched or insufficiently addressed this third thing of actually getting under the skin of those futures. So how do we scaffold our imaginations to think and feel things we haven't experienced before? Like, how do you do that? How do you get to depth? What's the next best thing to a time machine? And so I'm looking at the time, and I realize what I've wanted to kind of layer these these three dimensions of foresight in for you, and then kind of take you to experiential futures, which I suspect you probably actually have a pretty good handle on a lot of this already. So I'm going to shift gears a little bit and kind of basically fly through or do at a higher level of sort of like an aerial view of a bunch of specific experiences so that we leave some time for our conversation. So basically, to recap what I said right at the start about futures as a field, it involves engaging images of the future in any form. And it's kind of motivated or necessitated by the fact that as time goes on, things change, meaning that the world at a later time is different from how it is at an earlier time. And so the key insight is that it could be different in many different ways from the present. So we need diversity, which implies plurality. You can use plurality as the key word if you want, but I think diversity is helpful because it's a property of the plurality. You could have multiple futures, but if they're all just slightly different from each other, like low, medium, and high sort of sensitivity analysis. And I think sometimes that is a way that futures processes can fail, as being insufficiently diverse, even though they technically are plural. Anyway, so that's a second dimension that's important in the futures being considered. But having an array of different and diverse futures that are intellectually available is not enough to guarantee that they change how we think, feel, and decide now. So that's why I think this third dimension of depth is so important. So what can we do to make the future come alive, to make it count more? And this is kind of a question that I had in my mind when I went to grad school, because I had been involved in the futures field since I was in high school in the 1990s. And I worked for the Australian government and then, as I said, the British government on futures projects, and found that even when they were really done well by expert practitioners being skillful and careful and doing good research, that they didn't necessarily transform anybody's decision making. And so, the first futures conference that I went to was in 1997 at the University of Queensland in Australia, just down the road from where I was in high school. And there are recent kind of calls for arguments for like bringing science fiction more to bear on real life decision making. But I also want to note that science fiction and futures were fused at the outset, a century ago, like we said, with H.G. Wells calling for a capacity for foresight. So this stuff is the need to engage our capacity for imaginative storytelling is not a new thought at all. And there's, as I say, there's a rich prehistory of futures in the humans, in the development of this human capability. But the field as we found it, I would say, the field as it was when I came across it in the 90s, had sort of somehow forgotten this or lost sight of it, I guess. This kind of public imagining, this kind of cultural relevance, frankly. And so when I went to grad school in 2005 and the state came to us for help engaging the local population in thinking about co-creating a sustainability plan for Hawaii in the year 2050, almost half a century out, what my colleague Jake Dunnigan and I decided to do was to put people into 4 different versions of the year 2050. So we were only being paid, the Future Center where we worked at the university was only being paid to write scenarios and facilitate a conversation about them. And we decided to wildly over-deliver by putting 550 people into 4 different versions of the year 2050. So we wrote the scenarios. We still did that whole process, but then we translated them into experiences that people could have in their bodies that would ideally feel as though they were time traveling. And what this gave rise to was sort of recognition, okay, there's a whole array of ways of doing futures work that have sort of only been tentatively experimented with, not systematically explored. And so that was what I came to call experiential futures, the design of situations and stuff from the future to catalyze insight and change. The reason for the term experiential futures is because any experience that you could come up with that would help people wrap their bodies and minds around the proposition, around this supposed future set of circumstances, was fair game, regardless of what medium it was in. And so the idea was to explore ideas and propositions about alternative futures, to explore images of the future through material and performative and interactive forms, any medium at all. And experiential futures, or XF, obviously builds on a foundation laid by generations of futures scholars and practitioners. So it's not like invented from whole cloth, but what it is doing is sort of saying, look, in order to move people, we have to take these ideas out of the abstract. We've got to, by hook or by crook. And so what that led to was, as you saw, Hawaii 2050, then we started putting the artifacts that we had made for those workshops out in the world for people to stumble across. We made postcards for a workshop this was in 2006, with people who made their living from the tourism industry in Hawaii. But each postcard embedded a different theory of what could become of tourism as an industry 30 years out. And then we started sending those postcards to people's home addresses because we had, hundreds of these postcards that we hadn't used for the workshop. So that was sort of the beginning of what we called guerrilla futures work, unsolicited encounters with futures in wild and unscripted environments. This project was for Chinatown, Honolulu, asking what might become of this neighborhood. And again, without going into these details, just so you can see the variety of ways that we're bringing these to life, these stories came from our interviews with people who lived and worked in the neighborhood. So it wasn't just us dreaming them up and taking it upon ourselves to be arty. We were looking to ground the imagining in the concerns and priorities and sense making of people from and in the place. And we could unpack any of these images in terms of the semiotics, and the semantics, the choices about how we're signaling to incorporate the past and remix it into a future. It's site and context and language and culture specific in each case. And so this, ended up on the front page of the state newspaper, which told us that the first time we did this in Chinatown, which told us that we were doing something perhaps, that would generate a bit more attention than the standard approach to, futures on the page. We created an experience of a possible future on a panel at South by Southwest. People thought they were just going to a regular panel, and instead they found themselves at the memorial service for Dirk Diggler from the movie Boogie Nights. This project was for the state of Hawaii, but funded by the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, to give people an experiential glimpse of what a flu pandemic might be like. It was set initially 3 years in the future, and then in one of the weirdest experiences in my professional life that I've ever had, there was a flu pandemic for the first time in 40 years, a month before we launched this project. And so we turned it from being an alternate reality game set against the backdrop of a real, of an imagined pandemic 3 years away, to being an emergent reality game taking place against the backdrop of a real crisis, H1N1 swine flu. This project was for the California Academy of Sciences in San Francisco, bringing to life a century of exponentially increasing plastic production in the environment, and turning it into a bodily dilemma about whether you drink out of these water coolers. This project was co-created with 20 people at Arizona State University in 2012, based on the unearthing of a symbol in the archaeological record, a symbol that turns out to have appeared in the archaeological records of vanished civilizations about a generation before they vanished. And this project is an assignment or a brief which I've run with students in Canada, Mexico, US, Singapore, and it's called The Time Machine. And the task there is to basically turn an article or a scenario on the page into an immersive experience at the scale of a room. And these experiences, each one of them kind of brings to life a different proposition, a different provocation. And I will add that, and you can sort of you can see how the topics are very different from, the futures of artificial intelligence, to adoption, to the Arctic, to, public transport, to activism against, grassroots activism against state censorship, and on and on and on. I mean, basically the argument that this process comes from is that any future that you come up with, you have an entire world to work with. So when you're assigned into a room, your task is to figure out within the constraints of that sort of envelope of time and space what fragment of that world you can bring to life completely plausibly with basically no budget. So the lack of budget and so forth is those are part of the design constraints for bringing the world to life. So we've done, I guess I visited personally something like 70 or 80 futures in the form of guided tours, museum exhibits, underground gatherings, play tests, emergency drills, birthday parties, whatever you like. Even during COVID, which kicked in halfway through a semester, the students chose their own visions of the future that existed out in the world, like in printed form. So Donna Haraway's Cyborg Manifesto, they turned that into a future experience you could have on Zoom. This essay by the late Hazel Henderson and Fritjof Capra, looking back at from 2050 on a world where we learned from the pandemic, maybe what there is to learn from it. They turned this into a festival set in the year 2050. Well, this book by the CEO of Kickstarter was turned into a kind of Shark Tank style competition among entrepreneurs live on Zoom. And this book about the Green New Deal by Kate Aronoff and others was turned into a green energy symposium and a participatory, kind of conference online set in the year 2050. And so you'll see these other projects, like, again, I'm trying to avoid going into too much detail and to give you this sort of, I guess, fire hose kind of exposure to a whole array of ways in which we have sought to bring alternative futures to life, sometimes in scripted settings like classrooms, sometimes in totally unscripted settings like city streets, and sometimes in spaces in between, like this project, Nature Pod, was the launch of a hypothetical product as if it were real at Canada's largest interior design and architecture show. And so the organizers knew what we were doing. They knew that this was set in an imagined future. And if the participants looked at the fine print on the brochures we were giving out and so forth, they would have seen they were future dated, but it presented as a real experience in the present. So people's responses were kind of had an authenticity to them, because they, this wasn't, hey, what would you feel if da 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 da? We just did it. So that's another example of an experiential scenario brought to life in a different kind of context, and it was actually based on a classroom time machine from the ones that I flashed through. I'm going to finish up here in a few minutes. Just so after Nature Pod was a project called Nurture Pod, this is one of the very few that I've done that was actually an installation for a museum. But it's kind of learning from or importing some of the practices of guerrilla futures, even though this is at the Antwerp Museum of Contemporary Art. But it's sort of got some of these characteristics of the thing as if you would meet it in the wider world. So people could take away these brochures, that with the product specs, as if they were encountering it at a Best Buy or a MediaMarkt or something like that, perhaps in Austria, or an Apple store. And so this is about asking what if, but not just hypothetically. It's performing what if in 4 dimensions. And then work with real organizations on their issues. And this is actually a project that we did in collaboration or alongside our friends from Superflux and Changes for the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies. What we were asked to do was create guerrilla futures artifacts for installation at the conference venue. So again, these sort of objects from future worlds that were provocations about changing technological and humanitarian landscapes. This was designed to go on the back of toilet stalls at the conference venue. This was designed to go on the cash registers distributed throughout the conference venue where 1,000 people were staying. This was designed to go under people's hotel room doors. So they would receive an invitation to the Nobel Peace Prize ceremony for a future version of their own organization set a decade plus into the future. And even the internal Red Cross, Red Crescent team created they got the idea, they started creating business cards for jobs that didn't exist yet within the organization and leaving those lying around. So, this stuff can take so many different forms, so many contexts, so many audiences, whatever you want to do, really, whatever kind of conversation you want to have, there's a way to do it. This project, Imagination is a Commons, was for the UN Development Program, and we made objects inspired by one-on-one interviews with the participants on this panel. So Sophie Howe, the Welsh Commissioner for Future Generations, received an object specific to her location and to her imaginary, the things that she had shared with us, from a world in which animals have a say in how urban development processes take place. Nanjira Sambuli received a souvenir from an organization that doesn't exist, but in 2030 it does, which is about reclaiming social media platforms and having them be owned by their users rather than by billionaires or hedge funds. Roman Krasnarek received a souvenir from a world in which people are chosen at random, like for jury duty, to take part in ancestors' assemblies, taking account of the interests of generations to come and using the symbolism of the cover of his own book and also the place where he lived, Oxfordshire, as kind of part of the symbolic vocabulary for the coat that they wear during the ritual process of deciding with future generations. Marcela Sabino received an artifact from a future in which corporations convicted of ecocide by the International Criminal Court can be dissolved and executed in public. Corporations, not individual people. And Achim Steiner, the head of the UNDP itself, received a huge framed historical document from the year 2070, which is part of a world in which multilateral organizations like the United Peoples work with indigenous practices or to invoke and acknowledge everything that people have in common before they begin in on whatever it is that brings them together to battle it out. This is an idea inspired partly by the conversation with him and partly by the book Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Moore Kimmerer. So, and these things can be done on all kinds of timeframes, and if it's digital only, then it's digital only. I'm going to stop sharing there though and say, look, I hope that if I kind of recap the initial exposure to futures as a set of practices that deals with the contents of our minds, the images of the future that we carry around, and asks us to become more skillful with those by becoming conscious about what is at stake when we think about those futures and seeing the three dimensions of difference between the present and the future as dimension one, diversity of an array of alternative futures under discussion as dimension two, and then depth for each of those. You could, if they were real worlds, you could visit them. And so as practicing designers or media makers, we can mediate and create those experiences in the present to have a richer conversation, maybe make better decisions. And then the experiential futures sort of menu is massively multidimensional because it's really about bringing together an appropriate idiom, like a way of bringing to life whatever future or futures it is you're trying to discuss for whatever audience it is you're trying to reach. So I hope this was helpful, and if we have any remaining time, I'd love to hear what you all think of it and answer any questions you might have.
Wow, thank you so much, Stuart. This is brilliant. Really, really so helpful in helping all the students, kind of the framing of it. It's just love the idea of depth, diversity, and what was the first one? Actually, the depth is the last one.
Difference.
So difference, diversity, exactly. Yeah. And because we kind of have the speculative design part of it is often the depth part of it, and that's what a lot of us and our kind of skill set affords to, and time we spend doing. So, but bringing those two before that really helped to frame sometimes we go really big projects where people are looking at, currently one of the projects looking at geoengineering and consequences, and it can feel really big and overwhelming, and how do you move from that to the depth. So this is
Right.
really helpful, thank you. But I'm just going to, we have just about 10 minutes, so I'm just going to open it up for questions. People, students out there, you got anything? Yeah, there's Selma.
Where do I? Okay, super nice. Thanks. Hi, thank you for your talk.
Hello.
I
Sure.
was thinking that all your examples that you brought of speculative futures are quite negative, or like rather apocalyptic and depressing. And coming back to the quote you brought from Fred Pollock, that the images we imagine kind of dictate or like tell the future, or like influence the future. I wanted to ask like what you think about that. And my thought was there that shouldn't we then create like futures that underline our current problems, but kind of are more positive? And I wanted to ask how you work with that, or like what your opinions are on that.
Yeah, thanks for the question. So I'm showing you work that goes back to 2006, and I wouldn't necessarily do every project that I've shown here today the same way, or even do all the same projects. So, for instance, I think the Nature Pod and Nurture Pod projects are quite Black Mirror-ish in their sensibility. I mean, I did them before Black Mirror was everywhere, and I actually feel since then that that kind of imagining is probably pretty well taken care of and even saturated, and we don't really need to do very much of it. So I totally agree with you about that, and I think that the taking stock of what the landscape is asking for, the landscape of images of the future, and what's missing, what's under imagined. I think very often the answer is something galvanizing and exciting. And I find the word optimistic lends itself to thinking simplistically a little too much, but something that you can feel excited about rather than, provoked or depressed by. But I would also push back a little bit, because I think some of the projects, especially our recent projects, are quite frankly, almost utopian in their willingness or desire to think about change in at least what I consider to be preferred directions. I mean, maybe you don't like the idea of companies being executable if they commit ecocide. I think that's great. I'm really excited about that possibility. I think we should do that with, I think similarly, the idea of animal well-being, in an ecosystem as a sort of being taken into account as a matter of course, in terms of like an index of whether to proceed or when to proceed on a project or not. Like the thing that Sophie Howe received at her home in Cardiff was telling her that the grasslands near her home are now being reopened after being presumably kind of unavailable for like 20 or 30 years to allow them to rewild. That's a pretty exciting future to me. I don't see that as dystopian at all. But and actually one project I didn't get to, which I sort of feel it's probably worth flashing through if I can find it. But just a project we just did actually last week at Parsons, so the students engaged in this last week. This project is called The World at a Crossroads, and it's a series of responses to the IPCC's sixth assessment report. But it's basically making the particular scenario that everybody was trying to respond to was, what would it look like in Times Square if you could time travel there in 2040, and specifically to a version of 2040 where all of the recommendations, the climate action recommendations that the IPCC has made, if those were acted on. So it's not looking at the climate abyss, the worst case scenario. It's like looking at what it would look like if we got our act together. And so this video that you're watching is from one of the student groups, where they brought to life a monument commemorating the last car in New York City in the year 2030 and having conversations with people about it, that you can see these other projects where people have brought to life, basically fragments of renewing ecosystems, of organizations that have got their act together in ways that they currently don't, of business response, of the Civilian Climate Corps, which is an imaginary organization based on the New Deal actual organization, Civilian Conservation Corps, under Franklin D. Roosevelt. And, so these students were tasked with basically imagining positively. But what's positive varies depending on who you are as well. That's important to know. But so I guess all of that is to say, yeah, I agree with you, that finding that valence that excites, and that feels and that enables hope is probably the most urgent thing and constructive thing we can do. But I was showing you older work as well, and there is always, I think, also a value to being able to think pluralistically.
Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? We just have a few more minutes, but if anyone else has a question.
I have a question.
Yes.
Hi.
Hi.
Hi. You talked about this needs to have depth to have impact. Could you talk about the impact a little bit that your work you feel has had? Because that is a question we ask ourselves, and we get asked about this kind of work that we teach and do, what the impact of it is or could be.
Yeah, so there's a recent article at my ResearchGate link. You'll see there's about 4 dozen publications. One of the more recent ones of which is an interview or a roundtable about measuring impact. So I'll maybe share that link, because just in the interest of time. But I think one of the impacts that's underrated or underestimated is the impact on the people doing work. So the engagement by us as designers or interveners to do this imagining and to kind of to take proactive steps towards envisioning and materializing possible futures is huge. And I also think that the measuring impact, I mean, we could tell stories about when it's appeared to have had a positive impact or changed the way that futures is dealt with inside organizations. I think the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies is maybe an especially powerful instance of that, because within 2 years basically from a standing start, they changed how they talked about the future inside the organization, and more systematically engaged with the longer term. But I think I also want to note that the question sort of has this implicit assumption often built into it that the way we're doing things now is sort of somehow sufficient, and therefore the onus is on me or Anab or somebody to kind of to say, look, this is better. And actually, I don't think that's necessarily reasonable. I think it's demonstrable that the way that we currently, by default, talk about futures is not adequate. And it's also demonstrable that if we don't have, I showed this evidence from recent neuroscience, that we're limited by the imaginings. We're limited in our imaginings by the experiences we've had. So what the argument here is, in part, is that we need to try these different approaches to bringing futures to life as a precondition for them potentially having an impact. And then I'm happy for scientists and social scientists to come in after the fact and sort of try to measure how it's changing people's minds. But I think if the default assumption is that the status quo ways that we do these things is adequate, no, the onus should be on people not dealing with futures or dealing with them in these abstract only ways to prove that that's sufficient, because it's not, and we can show that these other ways at least have the possibility of working in a more transformative way.
Anyone else? Burning question for Stuart? What can the students read, listen to expand this thinking and process further?
Yeah, well, so I mean, I think there's a bunch of sort of, I guess you could say, it's not all academic, but there's a bunch of academic writing at the ResearchGate link, which I'll just drop in there. One of the more recent ones is that measuring impact conversation. There's also, I suppose I can put my blog, which has, what is it now? 17 years of posts. That didn't work as a link, but anyway, you can plug that in. And I think that it's a couple of years old now, but the Design and Futures collection that we touched on right at the start is also worth taking a look at. If people want to understand more about futures as a field and where that's at, there is a podcast series called FuturePod, which is now, I think, about 150 episodes in. And that's pretty interesting as a kind of series of dispatches from people involved in the field in different ways. So that would be worth looking at as well. And that's called, FuturePod podcast. I think if people want to understand more about experiential futures, I mean, the dissertation that I wrote in 2010 called The Futures of Everyday Life, which can also be found at that ResearchGate link, it doesn't talk explicitly about speculative design, because that wasn't a term that people were using at that stage. It does talk about, but it does talk about this wide landscape of ways of working, and also some of the, if you like, the kind of conceptual infrastructures of futures practice that I still think most designers they might be aware that they exist, but brandishing them like sort of saying, well, I'm talking about a possible future, doesn't really cut it. I mean, I think there's much more there's more rigor that can be drawn from a deeper engagement with futures practice. And I mean, you said just when we began the Q&A part, Anab, about difference and diversity, as sort of helpful companions, perhaps, to depth, which might already be built in to these ways of working. I agree with that. I think that the diversity part is especially important. There's one thing I'll say, a framework I would love for you all to take a look at, and it's actually in that Design and Futures collection. The article is called Turning Foresight Inside Out, and it's about a process called Ethnographic Experiential Futures, EXF, which a colleague of mine who used to be a student of mine and I wrote about. And what it does is sort of offer a process to go through whenever you're making an experiential scenario, or if you want to call it speculative design or whatever you call it. I don't really care. If the work is good, I don't give a stuff what people call it. But I think what's useful about that framework is sort of twofold. One is it starts with the question of whose futures are you bringing to life, right? So instead of asking the intervener / designer / artist to look entirely or exclusively to their own resources, so like what do I think is interesting, like doing some research to understand that landscape that we talked about of images of the future, and perhaps identifying people, as we did. This was actually the process that we followed for that UNDP project, Imagination is a Commons, like asking people who have something interesting to say and informed to say about a particular future landscape, and then grounding the work in what they say, is a way of operating more in service to a wider conversation rather than sort of spotlighting oneself, which I think would be useful. So there's a kind of rigor enhancing move that can be made there by attending more to where the ideas about the future that you're working from actually come from in the first place. And then the other thing that it does is it's a cycle. So it asks you, again, as a practitioner, to not just do the work and put it out in the world and say, I'm done, but to think about how you can close the learning loop and ask. This goes to the question that was just posed a few moments ago. Ask about impact. or ask about what difference it makes to have gone to the trouble of turning a future from a verbal proposition into an experience. And I guess actually that reminds me of another thing I want to say about that point, which is, and I'll end on this, which is that impact and measurement are, and particularly a measurement approach to impact, is those are disciplinary norms that come from disciplines other than design. About, you know, like the idea of trying to measure, trying to put a ruler next to how much somebody's mind is changed by an experience they have. I understand the impulse, but I think it's very often wrong-headed. And a more qualitative question like, what can we learn from this encounter with a future? Like, what new questions does it raise? What is it, you know, how does it lead you to revise your own thinking or challenge your own thinking about whatever the scenario is or whatever the topic is? That kind of conversational based engagement with what difference does it make, I think is more appropriate more of the time than trying to measure impact in a sort of social scientific way. And so I think that like, for example, the time machines are not those rooms that, you know, you make from a possible future, modular experiential scenarios. You don't just make the future and then leave. You have the experience and then you come back to the present and have a conversation about it. And in that assignment or in that format, the conversation is as long as the immersion, and it is as important as the design. So you might spend less time, you know, crafting what the questions are going to be and facilitating those than you did on, you know, going to the trouble of creating an immersive environment. But the conversation is the place where all of that design effort gets unpacked and turned into an opportunity for insight and sharing. So I think that's a kind of, both of those things about ethnographic experiential futures, whose future is this, and how can you serve the landscape that you're intervening in by, you know, using your design skill to lift up, spotlight, deepen, to do something more with thinking that's already there but underappreciated. That's one thing. And then the other is the closing of the learning loop with it doesn't have to be qualitative. I mean, you know, I had a student who sent around surveys after sending out letters from the futures of different social agents, like Alexa and Siri are social agents, right? Future social agents. She created letters from this future, from the series of futures, and then actually administered, you know, surveys that could be analyzed quantitatively as well as qualitatively. But that the move that you make to map the changes is a design space as well. And I think we can too easily fall into the trap of going along with other people's disciplinary assumptions about what knowledge is and about what kind of thing is worthwhile doing. And I think we need to stand in our own values a little bit more and make those decisions a bit more consciously in service of what we're trying to do, not what somebody else thinks we should be trying to do.
That's a great pep talk to end on. Actually, stand on our own feet and believe in what we do. Thank you so much, Stuart. Thank you on behalf of all of us here where I'm in London. The others are mostly in Vienna. Thank you for your time and generosity. We will value this for years to come. Thank you.
It's a pleasure. And I look forward to seeing seeing some of the work that comes out of your efforts. So thanks for including me in your journey.
Thank you. Take care and speak soon.
And Elizabeth, okay. Could you send out the chat to everyone? That would be cool. The presentation slide.
Thank you, everyone.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.